Thank you all for staying over to our second session. I think we can all agree that Erica is an extraordinary expositor of Texas and things Texan, and we're glad to have her. Now we have a gentleman whose heart is Texan, although he himself is a native, I've heard of various points, of Mississippi, South Carolina, Puerto Rico, Washington, D.C., Virginia, and what else are we claiming at this point, Ben?
Don't add Washington, D.C. to that mix. Don't slime me from the beginning.
Well, the good parts, by which I mean outbound 395. Let me read something to you, and this will all connect together in sort of a James Burke Connections fashion. Back in the 1840s, we're going to begin then, there was a priest, first priest ordained in Texas, I believe, first Catholic priest ordained in Texas, by the name of Emanuel Domenech, and he voyaged around Republic-era Texas and early state Texas, and if you look in the Handbook of Texas Online, which if you are like me, you read at every spare moment, you can read the entry on Emanuel Domenech, and he was French, a Basque, but from France, so kind of a double strike against him, and he traveled in Texas, and then he went back to France. Eventually, for the end of his life, with a sojourn in Mexico, working for the Emperor Maximilian, which what a pity that didn't work out. And so he ends up in France, and he ends up writing a book in France about being a missionary in Texas, being a Catholic priest in Texas. And he had this to say about Houston and Austin. Houston, he detested, quote, "The city of Houston is infested with Methodists and ants." Austin, a small, dirty town with only one wretched hotel. Perhaps not this one. So Emanuel Domenech went and did not like Texas. I'm pleased to let you know that we have a collateral descendant of Father Emanuel Domenech with us here today, Ben Domenech, who has joined us, who has a substantively higher opinion of Texas than his esteemed antecedent, albeit not ancestor. Let me read you some of Ben's credentials here. Ben is actually the senior fellow for healthcare policy at the Heartland Institute, so he spends his time battling the entitlement state. He is the editor of The City, which is the monthly, bi-monthly, quarterly.
It's quarterly, published
quarterly
by Houston Baptist
So I've
University.
become more infrequent as I guess further. A quarterly publication of Houston Baptist University, a very good literary endeavor. He was on as a 16-year-old on Bill Clinton's Social Security Reform Council. His advice was sadly not taken. I can tell you, when I first met Ben, I mean, Ben is an eminence in himself, a media figure, a regular on Glenn Beck's The Blaze, editor of the Transom newsletter, which you can find at thetransom.org, and is actually one of the best daily information synthesis newsletters available. If you want to know what's going on in the wider media world, subscribe to the Transom. It's mere pennies, and I assure you I receive no commission from this plug. It's mere pennies, but you will receive an email early in the morning that will tell you everything you need to know about what's going on in the world, with solid analysis besides. I've known Ben for quite some time. I can tell you that when I was a speechwriter for HHS Secretary Tommy Thompson, there was one day in which I was dismayed and appalled that this very young man of about 20 years old, I think, or we debated whether or not you were 12. In fact, this very young man came in as a speechwriter, which at the advanced age of 26, 27, I considered a terrible affront. Imagine my chagrin when I learned that not only was he better looking, but smarter as well. and a good writer, but what could have been a famous rivalry instead turned into a long-standing friendship. We went on to found redstate.com together, and even now, the one negative thing that I've been able to hold in my head about Ben Domenech, which is that he is a devoted Redskins fan, even that is tempered now that the Redskins have a Texan quarterback. So, like Rene Belloc in Indiana Jones, there is nothing I can possess which you cannot take away. Ben, thank you for joining us. You have been such a long-standing and distinguished observer of culture and media, and what we're here today to talk about, since this is our media day, and since Ben is somebody who is in, no offense, the Beltway universe, but also likes America, there's a disconnect between media and America. And I don't mean the old trope of real America versus fake America. New York City is also real America, right? Washington, D.C., much as we regret it, is also real America. But what are we talking about when we talk about the disconnect, the cultural disconnect between mainstream media and us in this room, or people in Kansas, or people in rural Oregon? Tell us about that.
Josh, I want to thank you first off for that glowing introduction. It's been a pleasure to know you all these years, and it's a pleasure to be here today in Texas. I love Texas, and worked for several Texans, including I was an intern in the White House under President Bush in his speechwriting office, and it was my pleasure to work for John Cornyn for 2 years as his speechwriter. I always appreciate being able to come to Texas because I think it's a place that appreciates what is best about America, and so it's great to be able to join you today. You asked me about the cultural disconnect, and I do think that that's the right way to frame it. We talk a lot about media bias, about partisan media bias, meaning that they lean to the left, that they're all a bunch of liberal Democrats, et cetera, and that kind of thing. That may be true. In fact, it usually is true. But the bigger bias that I think, and the one that's come to hold a greater danger, I think, to the way that our public discourse happens today, is a cultural disconnect in the way that people live and the way that they perceive the world. And I'll give you just one anecdote of this about an experience that I had earlier this year related to some conversations about a certain Texas university, where I made a comment about the latest news from SEC country to a producer who works for a conservative show, who is herself a conservative in New York City. And her response to me was, "Is that some kind of Wall Street joke?" Now, SEC country, to me, is a definable thing. It's a very important thing. Understanding SEC country is an important thing in terms of understanding a whole swath of Americans and the things that they prioritize.
Every Aggie in the room is Googling to figure out who that is now.
the values that they have and the things that they espouse. And to me, that's something that's always been defined. For people who come from a certain walk of life, when it comes to rising up the echelon to these key jobs in terms of dictating the ways that media engages with society in New York City, in Washington, D.C., they tend to be of a certain type, come from certain schools, and have certain interests, and have those interests shared among their friends. You know, the Pauline Kael line about not knowing anybody who voted for Nixon is still very much true, and it's unfortunate in the sense that I think that a lot of these people who are in media don't perceive themselves as having that bias, and really do think of themselves as being more traditionally American, that they don't have any big separation between the people who live in sort of the rest of America, with maybe the exception of Texas, and I think that Erica spoke to this most eloquently. There's another aspect of this, though, that comes into their frame, and that's the way that they perceive how people who live in this other part of America, this part that isn't New York and DC, relate to each other and the issues that are of most importance to them. I was reading just yesterday in Politico, obviously one of the most well-read Capitol Hill publications, a piece by one of their most prominent writers, Mike Allen, in which he was talking about Tom Cotton, the recently elected congressman from Arkansas. Cotton is, as you may know, a fellow who has 2 degrees from Harvard, who served in Iraq and Afghanistan, who was a successful business consultant, and who is now in Congress. Someone who is obviously a very intelligent, very accomplished person, who has accomplished more in his life than I would say a lot of journalists, no offense, will ever in theirs. And yet the editor had to take care to reiterate to people who were reading this article again and again that unlike the rest of his Republican Southern brethren, that Mr. Cotton is not a hick. In fact, using that word is not some backwoods redneck, and had to reiterate that to people. Now, I think for the rest of us who understand that the people who end up getting elected to these positions are usually not hicks and usually not rednecks, but actually very intelligent people, and the fact that their voice sounds a little bit different and that they prioritize college football over, say, lacrosse is not necessarily something that should be a defect. But I think that when it comes to our engagement with media, when it comes to the way that we understand media, we have to approach it with a large degree of skepticism, not just because of the political biases that may be in place for the reporters who are covering a story or who are talking about something, but also with an understanding that the vast majority of them approach the stories that they're talking about with a pre-existing worldview that biases them in favor of certain outcomes and in certain priorities. And I think that you particularly see that in the coverage of Texas. And I know that we'll get into this a little bit more, but I'll just draw one example of this. From my experience earlier this year and in the previous one, watching Texas covered during the presidential election and during sort of the rise of sort of this economic clash, this conversation about what we want to be as an economy going forward in America. I was struck again and again by how unfair the coverage of Texas was, to the point where you could essentially repeat anything bad about Texas, and people would believe it, regardless of whether it had any resemblance in terms of the facts. And I was frustrated by this, particularly in the area of healthcare outcomes and in terms of the coverage of that vicinity. In terms of an issue that I've observed from afar, Texas is really the gold standard when it comes to tort reform, when it comes to the approach that you have to the rising costs of healthcare due to a poorly constructed medical liability situation. And I was struck again and again by how unfair the coverage was from the New York Times and from other entities as well when it came to talking about these factors in Texas, depicting it as some sort of land where you were in this Hobbesian reality where you were all clawing for the last bottle of water. We all know that the reality is different from that, but I think that what we have to understand when we read these stories or when we see them passed around among friends, I think it's on us. The onus is on us who know the truth about Texas to speak up about it. And my job, I think, while it relates to other states as well, is to really come out with the true facts about what's going on the ground, the way that these systems actually work, the people who are actually engaging in them. There are problems, of course. There are things that need to be improved. There are reforms that need to happen. Texas Public Policy Foundation is addressing these in a number of ways. But I think that the most important thing that I should say is this: you have to be your own fact checker, because the fact checkers themselves are often not doing actually their jobs when it comes to that form of society. And so I think it's on you to essentially push back against these false reports that you may see on your Facebook page from friends or shared around in your community. And I'm sure TPPF as well, am happy to be a resource to you in those efforts. So.
Let's talk about the system that produces these outcomes. When you talk about reporters and journalists who are not equipped to view reality, so to speak, and in terms of the type of state that Texas is, for example. I'm looking here at a printout of by no means should you rush to read this article. It's from August 2011, but it's by Jason Cherkis, noted. Yeah, right. So we start to laugh.
Yes, sorry.
Yes. Jason Cherkis from the Huffington Post, and I'll just read the headline. Rick Perry's Texas miracle includes crowded homeless shelters, low-wage jobs, and worker deaths. By the way, that sentence is true of the other 49 states as well. By the way, but this is the horror story. Now look, some of this is we, especially those of us who work in politics and policy and media, can often overlay an agenda-driven bias to that, and that exists, and we'll talk about that. We'll get into. I think people here would be very interested to learn about journalists, for example.
Yeah.
But there's a system that produces these people. Can you walk us through two things? First of all, the methodological flaws of J-School, and secondly, the career path of these bright young things that end up at the New York Times and Washington Post, and why that doesn't serve them.
Yeah. Well, first off, I think that we all understand that when it comes to the experiences that we have in our jobs, we usually went to school to study things that were within that area. I studied government and English, ended up as a speechwriter, et cetera. There are other people who studied other aspects of what they do, and they end up doing a job that's related to those areas. If you wanted to become a journalist, however, you go through a journalistic school experience, which often doesn't actually equip you to do the job that you're supposed to be doing, particularly in the area, particularly in the wake of the kind of shifts that we've seen within the marketplace over the past several decades when it comes to the rise of internet journalism and all the various speed factors that come into play there, where you can report something and have it go around very quickly, no matter how inaccurate it is. Journalists are not actually given, in a lot of their experiences, the ability to report about the issue area where they will spend most of their career reporting. I'm struck again and again by the journalists who I interact with on the entitlement space and within the healthcare space, how little background they actually have in those policy areas. Instead, they went to school and they learned how to be a journalist in the general sense of the term, in a way that is designed, frankly, to serve the old way of doing media, to do the old sort of local journalism reportage. That approach is really very distant from the kind of burden that exists today and the kind of complex systems we have to understand the policies that are going on, to understand the various factors that are in play, the various motivations that are pushing from outside the market. It would serve them much better to specialize in terms of their studies and in terms of their background in that area, or to work in that field before they end up reporting. Michael Crichton had a line, the late great Michael Crichton, about the divide between the way that you might perceive a news story. And he talked about how when, his background was in medical science and was, somebody who had worked in an ER and everything like that. And he talked about how whenever he read a healthcare story, it would be full of inaccuracies, full of factual problems that would really, prevent him from being able to enjoy the story. In terms of your own experience, you may have something similar happen if you're familiar with energy, if you're familiar with education or something like that, there's stories that you might read in your local newspaper that would strike you as just being full of all sorts of errors. And yet you would turn the page over and read a story about something that you may not know as much about and just assume that everything in it is accurate, when in reality the same effect is in play. And so while I may read something in a magazine about entitlement policy that makes me go, well, that's wrong and that's wrong, when I turn the page over and I'm reading something about India and Pakistan, I may assume that that's all on the up and up. There's another factor as well, and that's the cultural bias, I would say, that we may not really fully appreciate as people who are not as well engaged in the kind of social interaction that we see between journalists and politicians. I think it would maybe surprise many of you how many prominent journalists at many prominent networks are married to people who are press secretaries and communications staffers for not just members of Congress, but in some cases the Vice President of the United States. I think that that's the sort of thing that would give people pause, in the sense of, are you ever going to be able to fairly cover this person when they're essentially your wife's or your husband's employer? I think that that's something that we don't really fully appreciate. And in terms of the way that a lot of journalists work their way up the ladder in terms of having opportunities, being able to reach sort of prominent stature, it's often something that is done not necessarily on merit, but tied more to, as in any other industry, who you know. Something that unfortunately in the journalistic space has led to this kind of ongoing nepotistic attitude towards people who work their way up the chain. And Josh mentioned the Bright Young Things. I think it doesn't serve media actually to have this sort of thing happen, in terms of people who have never worked in an industry, never went to school about that industry, never studied that industry before, and yet are able to become prominent voices in that area, given a megaphone to talk about a subject that they may or may not know anything about, and they end up having to rely on sort of their instincts when it comes to assessing who's saying the right things. In that sort of situation, it tends to be that they value the opinions most of those who are closest in agreement to them on some matter. That's, I think, something that doesn't really serve the community of readers well, the community of those of us who absorb this media well. And again, I think it's something that a lot of people aren't really mindful of when they just take all of this stuff that's coming in and try to digest it.
I'm thinking specifically about many of the early part of this century, the bloggers. And look, we're part of that generation. I mean, you and I, too. Well, you're extraordinary, right? But I'm here why I am because co-founded Red State, and so we're part of this generation that many of us in the public square came up as bloggers, and I'm curious as to your thoughts on whether that has served the process ill or well. I'm going to prejudice the discussion a little bit by arguing that it's been more ill than not. With apologies to the bloggers in the back there, we love you all. But I'm thinking about one terrible example. A young gentleman from a very parochial community called the Upper West Side. His name's Matthew Iglesias. And he is famous. Pardon me, could somebody from AV take care of HAL 9000 back here? Iglesias is now, is he with Slate?
Yes.
As the prophets foretold, yes?
Yes.
So
he's the business, I believe he is the business columnist.
The business columnist, of course, yes. Having not worked in business, who is more objective than a fellow from a literary family? The Iglesias wrote this marvelous post when he worked for The Atlantic, which is sort of, if you don't know The Atlantic, it's kind of this troll blog, like Gawker. This was in 2007-ish.
Yes.
This is when he lost the Everglades.
Yes.
And so this is, but this is, I think this illustrates what you're talking about. He gets this satellite map of the Miami-Dade area in South Florida, and he posts a photograph, and he says, I've noticed something very interesting about Miami-Dade is that the urbanization of Miami-Dade is entirely confined to the coast, and it stretches north-south, and when it expands in a north-south direction. And where is the entrepreneurial genius who will buy the land directly to the west of Miami-Dade? And this gentleman had no idea that there was a large swamp called the Everglades next to Miami-Dade. And so there's infinite numbers of examples of this, but I'll stop there because I don't want to make this about my vendetta against Iglesias. But how has this phenomenon, this generation, which again you and I are part of, has this been a positive or a negative? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I would say that I think in the larger scope it has been more ill than good, mostly because you've seen a lot of voices come out who've been able to not just get access to the megaphone, but get access to congressional members, to people particularly in the mix in Washington. And one of the things that I think you see about people who sort of rise in this way is that they're, one, more easily manipulated because they don't understand the issue set, and so they have to rely on people who they view as experts. Mm-hmm. But number two, I think it's because you can have stupid ideas that survive for a much longer time. In the traditional way of sort of doing journalism in the old days, and I include doing sort of political journalism in the commentary sense, you would have to have a process. You would have an editorial process that you would go through where other people would look at your stuff before it goes up. And just that little process that sort of says, well, maybe this isn't a good idea. Have you heard of this swamp in Florida, for instance? And that sort of process that would prevent someone from making kind of a dumb statement and having it go around for a while before it gets pushed back, is no longer in place. Essentially, everyone's been given the keys to just rush out there with whatever you have. Now, this increases the speed of everything, which is to some sense a good thing in the sense that conversations can happen in real time. People can work through policies in real time, and you have, I think, some advantage from that. When it comes to the activist side of things, people who are outside of Washington can make themselves heard much earlier in the process without these things going on in smoke-filled rooms. But I think that you also get from that a false sense of maybe what the priorities are. I think you see this most recently in this conversation, which has been pushed primarily by board bloggers who don't really have anything else to talk about, of a platinum $1 trillion coin to solve all of our problems. You may have heard of this.
Well, no, I think you should explain this.
So in brief, just because I don't want it to take up too much time, essentially, as a possible way for President Obama to get around the clash, the debt ceiling clash that everyone sees coming, which is essentially an opportunity for Obama to escape a conversation about spending at all. He is being urged on by certain journalists and certain economic loons like Paul Krugman of the New York Times to mint a platinum coin, which would essentially allow him to increase the amount of money that the Treasury has to meet our obligations without having to go through Congress. Something that he is only able to do because of a law that was passed many years back originally authored by Mike Castle, a congressman formerly from Delaware, who left open the possibility of the Treasury minting these coins, not as an actual unit of currency, but simply to provide for coin collectors and things of that nature. They're banned in other areas. I think that this is a particularly ludicrous idea that really would only survive in the era of the internet. But again, it's something that I think depends on sort of people of shall we say, less than serious background when it comes to understanding how our economy works and how currency ought to work. When it comes to their engagement in these things, that's the sort of outcome of this era when we open the floodgates and let anybody with an idea essentially take that idea to the public, and it depends more how many people who are following you on Twitter and Facebook in terms of spreading that idea than necessarily the merits of it.
A coin with a $1 trillion face value.
Yes, a $1 trillion face value. Yes. So you could actually do it out of anything. You could do it out of cheese. I've suggested that you do it out of Justin Bieber or something like that.
$1 trillion coin is the setup for the greatest heist movie ever. Ocean's 14, for example.
Ocean's 14, exactly.
So let us hope. I want to put some historical context on this, though, and I'm going to push back on a bit on what you said, but also on what I said previously. When you go back to 1790s America, which is essentially the period in which the United States is having the real debate on what freedom of speech means.
Yes.
And so the debate is essentially between the high federalists on one side, who argue that the First Amendment, like the Second, needs to be exercised responsibly with adult supervision, essentially. So the editors that you're talking about. And then on the other side, you've got the Democratic Republicans, the Jeffersonians, who won the debate eventually with the Revolution of 1800. And we eventually ended up getting the First Amendment that we know and love today, in which you can say all sorts of ridiculous things like, let's mint $1 trillion coin. The High Federalists would have stopped that,
Yes,
right? So,
yes.
but is this not?
And let me just interject.
Please.
Much of the conversation, much of the debate about these policies was carried on in the form of pamphlets, which were often anonymous, in much the same way that you see the kind of anonymous bloggers and commentary today. Anyway.
Right. Although I don't know what a slate pitch would be for 1794.
I don't know, but I think Alexander
George
Hamilton
Washington
would have at least 12 different
Yeah, he probably would.
aliases as he was criticizing the Jeffersonian.
Him and Madison. Is George Washington setting himself up to be crowned king?
Yes. This
All
would
right.
be
Well,
the
good. I'm
topic
glad
of
we
the
agree
day.
on that. But like, isn't this kind of the same debate? I mean, aren't you and I on putting ourselves on the side of the High Federalists and the wrong side of history? I mean, isn't the future? Doesn't the future look like the face of Matthew Iglesias and Ezra Klein?
Well, I think what I would say about this is, to a certain extent, I go back to the idea that Ronald Reagan had, which is that we ought to trust the people, and I think that the people ought to be trusted and should be trusted, and that they will eventually figure things out. Unfortunately, I think that what we're seeing today is the outcome of essentially 20 years of education, public education primarily, urging people to forget the 1970s, to take no lessons from the end of the Cold War, and to come away from the experiences of the previous 20 years with none of the lessons that many of us today know were learned through experience about the way that we should engage the world, about which economic values were best, what worked best for society. I think, unfortunately, we see a situation today where the whole of the system has been bent towards forgetting all of that, towards pushing that away. And with that comes a lack of knowledge in terms of how people engage in the various voices that you're talking about. Unfortunately, from my perspective, I think that sometimes you have to be reminded of that from experience. This is sort of the Kipling poem of the gods of the copybook headings. We don't have copybooks anymore, but we still have to learn that fire will certainly burn us and that water will certainly wet us. And unfortunately, you have to sometimes learn that by being dunked or by being set aflame. I think in similar terms, we have to learn to a certain extent the negative side of the kind of economic policies that a lot of these voices advocate. And I think that we are going to learn that over the next couple of years in terms of the economic stagnation that we see at a national level. And we have to instead take the right lessons away from the proper approach to the way these things are managed, namely in the form of comparing Texas to the kind of experience that we have in California and in the nation as a whole. And that, I think, is why it's so important to have voices who are highlighting this, who let people know this is not the only way, that stagnation when it comes to unemployment, that permanently high entitlement states, that permanently overburdened medical liability claims, that permanently high costs of doing business and regulation are not a necessity, that they are not something that we have to accept as an inevitability, and that there is a very big difference between becoming a permanent member of the welfare and entitlement state and being someone who instead has the opportunity to engage and earn success. That's something that I think we all know, and that we know from experience, and that we know from an understanding of history. But if we're not going to step in and make sure that we reform these systems that have been so bent on erasing any of that knowledge from the minds of the next generation of not just voters, but elected officials, unfortunately, then we are going to see the country have to go through a much more painful bout of experience in order to learn those lessons.
I think it's a very interesting point that you make, and I want to return to what you started with, which may have been an arbitrary number, but I think it's dead right that there's been a 20-year period, a 20-year gap, essentially from roughly the beginning of the Clinton administration, which will take us coterminous culturally with the end of the Cold War into the modern day, and that you've had almost a generation for the mores and the outlook and the lessons of that era, which were tremendously different. But those of us who remember the 1980s, 70s, 60s, a very, very different atmosphere to grow up in. One of the interesting breakdowns in the 2012 presidential election, and you and I have talked about this briefly, but I want to hear your thoughts more in depth on it, is that when you look at the various demographic groups that voted for Mitt Romney and voted for the president, the split is it falls along various lines, but one of the most interesting to me is the age split between Romney voters and Barack Obama voters. The youngest person to ever vote for Ronald Reagan on any ballot today, so we're talking about an 18-year-old in 1984, is now 46 years old. 46. The Reagan generation is approaching the half-century mark. And perhaps coincidentally, but I suspect not, when you split the 2012 vote at age 46, 46 and above, they went majority Romney. Now, by the by, I don't mean to equate Romney with conservatives there, but it's a good rule of thumb for this particular analysis. 46 and above, they went majority Romney, majority Republican. 46 and below, they didn't just go majority Barack Obama. They went supermajority. When you're talking about people under 30, it's a 60% voting bloc. So you're seeing a very, very significant split, which falls exactly along the lines that you posit. And what I want to know is this: do you see that in your experience in media?
Yeah. Well, I think that number one, I do see that in my experience in media, but I think that something else that sort of comes in and is is sort of a factor that I think we can't underestimate when it comes to assessing this problem, is a real shift in the way that people on the center right engage media. Let's rewind to the creation of Time magazine, obviously one of the greatest media entities to come out of America in the past century. Henry Luce, when he started Time, and Luce was essentially an Eisenhower Republican, wrote a list of prejudices that he would use in the editorial direction of the magazine. And these included a skepticism for the growth and expansion of government, of power and of its scope, a skepticism for the rising costs of government and how much they are assessed on the people. A global perspective in terms of the value of trade and of freedom, and engagement in terms that valued neighborhoods and society, community engagement. All of these are essentially small, sort of our center-right engagements in terms of the way that he viewed the country. And you saw that in the early decades of Time's existence in terms of how they covered different stories and how they looked at things. This is mass media. Over the past 20 to 30 years, and I would say that this is something that you see throughout mass media, you've seen a disengagement on the right. Now, there are many excellent center-right publications that produce great work and that print interesting articles. These are small circulation magazines. They are not large, engaged mass media entities. In fact, if you look at the top 100 circulation magazines in the country, and unlike newspapers, magazines are actually doing well, believe it or not. In terms of circulation, you'll see there are maybe 3 or 4 right-leaning publications in there, and that has to include things like Good Housekeeping and things that have just sort of this perception of the way that a good home should look or a good life should look. And many of these are publications like Reader's Digest that essentially have, as you said, a cutoff of readership where they're all pretty much that 46 and older demographic. And then you'll see a list that is completely chock full of pop cultural magazines. Now, from their perspective, they may not think of these publications as political. Okay? You may not think of these publications as political. But look a little bit closer, and what you will see is a completely homogeneous approach to their view of virtually every political and cultural attribute, the things that they value and the things that they say are important. These include coverage of things like the idea that you could get free birth control, as if no one could pay for it. Believe it or not, there is no such thing as free birth control. But here's the thing that I think you come away from.
That's not what I heard.
Yes. So here's what I think you come away from with that. If you have if you have essentially the vast majority of mass media publications, of mass media television, of the kind of cultural entertainment, et cetera, that is out there, emphatically being produced by the types of people who either really do believe or are happy to say that Mitt Romney is going to crawl through your window at night to steal your tampons, then you have a problem. And that problem, I think, is repeated and expanded across society as these generations get older. They have never been exposed to these ideas, these small c, conservative and libertarian ideas about the way that they could live their life. And because of that, they view conservatism and they view these values as being associated only with political leaders. I think that's a very dangerous circumstance to reach, and it's one that you're never going to really change without a greater engagement from the center-right in these sorts of things. And so when I talk to people about what needs to be done in terms of conservatism or sort of teaching these lessons to people, I always point out, I would much rather have conservatives, engaging from the right through these kinds of mass media devices that elevate stories that I think we all know about that tell the story of why we believe what we believe. I think of an example that I use time and again about a young mother who went through the Medicaid system in Louisiana and the various crises that she faced. This was a story that was reported in the New York Times. And I think that the reporter who sort of reported it didn't realize that the lessons that you would take from her experience were conservative lessons about the reason that entitlement reform needed to happen, that we have a system that no longer serves the poorest of the poor or the sickest of the sick, but it is in actuality a prison that prevents them from increasing. In Pennsylvania, most recently, there was a calculation done that found that essentially the cutoff, the point where you should stop making money if you are a single mother, is $29,000 a year. Because the instant that you make more money than that, you are actually losing money in terms of the value that you get from the entitlement state. This is a circumstance that cannot endure. We cannot continue to pay for this. And what's more, it's one that leads to a horrible life for the single mother and for her children. But that single mother is also the kind of story that President Obama elevated as the ideal of the future during the campaign. Julia, the cradle-to-grave, welfare state, someone where, family is not there to take care of her, neighborhood does not exist. This, I talked about, Reagan at the beginning and trusting the people. His mantra was family, neighborhood, work, peace, freedom in 1980. That meant certain things to the people who heard it. I'm not sure that it means those things today to the people who would hear that mantra. And I think that speaks to the absence of people on the center right from these broader cultural debates, highlighting these stories that need to be highlighted. We cannot count on this new generation of journalists to either know these stories, to highlight them, or to seek them out. And I think that's why we need to be more engaged in this way from the right. And that doesn't just fall onto the people who can afford to buy a magazine. I think it also it falls on people like yourselves who are frankly the new influencers in terms of the way that these stories spread. The fact is that there are now bloggers here in this room, and there are people all across the state of Texas who have larger circulations in terms of their own readership than many, sort of mid-market newspapers and things of that nature. And I think that it's on them to sort of highlight these stories and to take these stories to the American people.
How do you do it, though? And let's contextualize this with the 2012 experience.
Sure.
I'm going to deliver intentionally. I'm going to deliver what I think is a bit of a shallow critique, but a critique nonetheless that must be contended with. We are now entering year 5 of the Obama presidency, and one of the major projects on the right, especially in media, was the creation of alternative institutions. Red State, which we co-founded. Breitbart, for example, the Hot Air Network and the Malkin
Yes.
Empire, and so going on down the line. This is not to single out any particular institution, but the day after Election Day, it turned out that the unskewing was kind of skewed, right?
Yes.
And so there's the critique that this didn't work. Our alternative institution building has not happened in the proper way. Now, as I said, I don't think this is a complete and fair critique in many ways, but I want to know what you think of it, because I think it plays directly into what you're saying here, and the need to engage in a different fashion.
So the critique in the wake of the election from the left and from many of these journalists has been, conservatives live in a cocoon. They are insulated from reality.
Epistemic closure.
Epistemic closure, exactly, is the phrase that they like to use, this academic sounding phrase, which actually makes them all sound ridiculous because they don't know what the words actually mean. But here's the thing that I think you should take away from this idea of cocooning. What they're actually talking about, I think, is less reflective of what reality is. If you look at the data, people who watch Fox News are also more likely to read other sources as well. They're more likely to be engaged in news, period, in the sense that they're interested in what's going on. What I do think is a fair critique is that the cocoon that we have wound, that does exist to a certain extent, is an opinion cocoon that never really translates itself into a way that Americans who are outside of that cocoon can relate to. And I'll just give one example of this that has nothing to do with domestic politics. I think in the lead up to the election, there were several weeks there where just about every entity on the right was talking about what went on in Benghazi. Now, what went on in Benghazi is something that I think is important. I don't mean to diminish its importance. But it also has very little to do with the problems that actually affect Americans where they are. Bill Clinton, who I actually do think has some interesting advice that we should heed on this point, was giving advice to the president in the wake of the 2010 elections when he saw the rise of the Tea Party, the rise of the conservative movement. And he talked about how the president had gotten away from speaking about people in a way that had a narrative that they could understand. And he talked about the fact that the way that the American people engage in politics, the vast majority of them, not the politically engaged, which I'm sure all of you in this room very much are, but the vast majority of Americans engage in politics from the perspective of the problems that are right in front of their face, the things that are addressing them where they are. And so because of this, people who are in politics or in policy need to talk about the problems that happen because in that same way, in a way that addresses the problems in front of people's faces with the challenges that are addressing them where they are. And I think if you look across the country today, the challenges that people are concerned about are not necessarily Dodd-Frank, are not Benghazi, but are things like rising healthcare costs, which are only going to get worse under Obamacare. They care less, I think, about income taxes and regulation in the big sense as the ramifications of those. They care more about the payroll tax. They care more about the education that their children are receiving. You know, just using education as an example, something that was talked about very little in this campaign. I interviewed Michelle Rhee for something related to Glenn Beck's project. During the election and brought up with her, why is nobody talking about school choice in this election? It seems to me that education is one of the biggest policy areas where we have to make a change now in order to adapt to the global economy of the next several decades. And she said, I know, I'm shocked by it. From my perspective, education is an argument that conservatives have definitively won. They've won it not just with data, but with the principles involved, with the moral argument involved, with the argument that children should not be imprisoned in systems that fail to serve them well and only serve the interests of teachers' unions. That's why you see inner city mayors scrambling all over themselves to try to find some way to make a deal with the local business community or moderate Republicans in order to bring some variety of school choice to what they're doing. In fact, the president and his administration are one of the last bastions in the country of people who are opposed to that kind of reform, and they do so because of how much they're in hock with the teachers' unions. From my perspective, that's the kind of issue that conservatives ought to not just be leading on, but ought to be highlighting in terms of the stories, the conflict that happens between kids who are trapped in failing systems and the administrators and union workers who are trying to keep them there. I think that you see that play out most recently in your neighbor in Louisiana, where you have, essentially, the legacy of Milton Friedman in terms of the largest, school choice system in the country, and you have the only people who are standing in their way, these entrenched teachers unions who are specifically suing the state over the fact that they want to be able to close down failing schools and fire teachers who don't do their job right. I think that's about as clear-cut of an argument that just about every American should be able to understand, and yet it's one that we barely spend any time talking about because instead we are talking about things that were just, I think, too high level to engage with people. So the cocoon that I think exists is less about sort of insulating ourselves from the reality of sort of where things are. I think that there are a lot of pessimistic conservatives out there who are sort of reassessing that type of thing. But instead, I think it's about learning how to speak to people who are not as engaged in politics as you are, who are not as engaged in policies as you are. And so starting from the sort of ABC of this is what we think, this is why we think it, as opposed to jumping further down the road to saying, well, this is why we need to take this legislative step, or why you need to have an opinion about HR, whatever the number is. And that's, I think, the kind of change that needs to happen on our own parts in the way that we engage culture.
Clinton's 2010 advice to President Obama, which clearly the president took and successfully employed in 2011, 2012, was presaged by Zephyr Teachout's article in either The Nation or Mother Jones. And I'm sorry I have to admit that I've read The Nation or Mother Jones in April 2010. But this is an article well worth reading. It was, and you and I have discussed this before. It was I believe 7 lessons from the rise of the Tea Party. So we're talking mid-spring, late spring 2009. The Tea Parties are arising for the first time. And Zephyr Teachout, who is a left Democrat activist analyst, she's very unpopular on her side because she tells the truth a lot. She wrote that the Tea Parties, which at that point, by the way, I mean, it's important to understand that the original manifestations of the Tea Parties were not the Republican rank and file turning out. They were, for the most part, people who really hadn't been involved in politics before, who were so alarmed by the state of the nation that they came out and did something about it. And so what Teachout's thesis was this, was that the Tea Parties at that point were in a pre-partisan position. And what they were really going for was a sense of exactly what you're talking about here, Ben, which is issues that were moral and immediate, that satisfied those 2 conditions, and really spoke to the concept of a fair society. When you look at the 2 broad mass popular movements, nonpartisan popular movements, put nonpartisan in quotes, popular movements of the Obama first term, you're really talking about the Tea Party and Occupy. And the intersection between the 2 is this intersection on fairness. And Arthur Brooks at AEI has talked a lot about this. So agreeing with your prescription that we need to talk about it, I want to press you a bit. Why haven't we? Is it because we're talking to ourselves?
Yeah, I think part of it is that we've all taken the lesson from our experience in the entrepreneurial place and in our places of business, that fairness means equality of competition. It means a transparent system, one where you can't game the outcomes, and one where if you have the right product and the right business plan, if you work hard and really invest your energies in something, you make the right decisions, then you will be rewarded by the marketplace for making those right decisions. That's what we really believe fairness is on the center right. I think that the fact that the president has been able to win this argument about fairness is just one of the most ridiculous and insulting things that I've seen in my time, in the sense that, this is a guy, I mean, let's back up a second. You can have your opinions about the president and where he comes from. From my perspective, he's actually not that interesting of a guy. I think he is essentially a traditional machine politician when it comes to the way that he engages with businesses and communities. The bias toward cronyism within not just Obamacare, but within bailing out the big banks, within every step that his administration has really taken. The idea that they were going to not hire any lobbyists and then they hire a slew of lobbyists. We're not going to have meetings with lobbyists and then we cross the street to have meetings in the coffee shop so it won't get on the White House entry form. That sort of step really, to me, typifies the way that he has approached virtually every policy situation, which is the idea to get stakeholders around a table, by which he means people who pay to play, and if you don't pay, then you don't get to the table. That, to me, is a situation that is ripe for the right to offer their counter, which is to say, we want a system that gets away from playing any of these games, where people actually do rise and fall based on their own decisions and are able to and have to deal with the outcomes of making bad ones, but also reap the rewards when they make good ones. And I think that that's an argument that needs to be made not just with data, because I think there are a lot of good people who make arguments with data. Paul Ryan was speaking at an event that I was at recently, and I think he still gives excellent arguments from the data, from the PowerPoint sort of perspective on these matters. But I think that what we need more is the kind of arguments advanced by Arthur Brooks at AEI and others who have made the moral case for free enterprise, from the perspective that it actually is not just what we care about when we talk about the pursuit of happiness is not just property rights or the things that come with that, but actually wanting you to be happy. And what we learn when we look at the social science data, and something that the founders knew instinctively, is that if you do not earn something, then you actually aren't happy about it. And this is one of the things that we've seen in sort of, you may have read all these different pieces that are out there about how we have all these wonderful metrics of how good society looks, of better health care, of longer lives, of better earnings and better earning power, and yet people are more and more pessimistic about their lives. And I think that has tracked quite well, frankly, with the growth of the entitlement state and with the idea that you are no longer able to connect what you earn with the pride of ownership, of being able to walk away from that and saying, yes, I did good work and yes, I deserve this. I think that there's a big gap between the left and the right on this, and one in which they are essentially offering a disagreement with us on the freedom front. We've assumed for a long time that freedom was a value that all Americans shared above other ones, when in reality what might be shared is a value of security. And I think that that's essentially what the president is offering. Now, unfortunately, this offer is a lie. The systems that he's using to engage you and to say, I can guarantee you security in life, economic security, that you will have to worry for nothing, all of those are based on assumptions that are not just fraudulent, but unfortunately, the bill will come due long after he has gone from office, unless he takes the advice of some at the New York Times and gets rid of that amendment. So here's the thing that I think we have to understand about that. We have to reframe the way that we talk about free enterprise from a moral perspective and from a fairness perspective in order to connect with people where they are and to teach them, I think, the lessons that they need to learn about the way that an ideal marketplace would work. You see that, again, in Texas, in the sense that you have that level of transparency, but you also have, I think, a system where people understand, that taking risk is necessary if they want to aspire for a better life, not just for themselves, but for their family. And I think that that's something that, unfortunately, on the right, we've gotten away from talking about. Instead, we only talk about it in terms of boardroom politics as opposed to kitchen table politics.
I'm sorry?
5.
Oh, we have 5 minutes for questions. Well, I had a trenchant insight, but I think I better let it go. Do we have questions for Ben? Anyone? Yes, yes, sir. You, and then Mr. Groban. Yes. Microphone, please.
You both sort of touched on this concept of accountability and free speech in journalism. About buying the Everglades and such. People saying silly things, and then you got into this this discussion of negative perception of conservatism in mass media, and the internet seems to have a natural accountability system in the comments page sometimes, and then the ability of people to quickly respond to stories as they happen. But to me, it always seems that system fails in a sense because of what you talked about, the cocooning, which even though you were saying it's generally a criticism of the left on the right, but I think it happens to some degree on both sides, and it seems like people a lot of the times these days only read the voices they agree with. And the only time they encounter those voices they don't agree with is when they pop up, in the mainstream media, those center-left voices that are so often, I think, we see, the Piers Morgans of the world. So I guess my question is, how does the compartmentalization of media affect accountability in journalism, and how do you think that has really harmed the conservative movement?
I think the one reason that it hasn't been quite as harmful is only because people have such a distrust of media today, in the sense that because they've learned over the course of years that the media, you can look at the grades, and basically media is almost as unpopular as Congress, and in some places less popular. But the thing that I think you do have to, and you're right about sort of the cocooning effect. But there's one area in particular where I think you see this, and I think that's in the age of the fact checker. You've all become familiar with fact checkers, who essentially are people who write thinly disguised opinion pieces and then say that it's a fact. I actually wrote something that was at Forbes recently at the end of the last year of the top 10 fact checks of the previous year, and they include sort of the various types of fact check, which include things like that thing that you didn't say is false. That thing.
True but false was
true but false. Yes. True but false was actually believe it or not, the way that one fact check at the Washington Post actually ended was true but false, because they said that people would not understand the outcome of the necessary things to take away from that term. I think that to a certain extent, what's needed is a reassertion on people on the right that we're going to hold these people accountable for essentially repeating these falsehoods and these opinions, disguising them as facts. And I think that that's something that doesn't happen overnight. Yes, there is the comment section and things like that. But I think that we have to have some of these entities that already exist, and some entities that may be yet to be created need to rise up in order to counteract these, push back against them, and also to offer stories, frankly, that counter their existing narratives that are only going to persist if they don't receive a response.
Okay, I'm afraid we have time for one question, then we have to close. So, Mr. Grobman?
I don't know if you'll have enough time to address this, but I'm interested in the high points. In the Fiscal Cliff discussions, we conservatives got totally slaughtered. I'm wondering what advice you would have for the conservatives in Washington, both of them who remain, regarding the upcoming deficit ceiling discussions.
Well, I think that while my expertise is on the entitlement front, what I'll suggest is that there is very little indication from either party of a seriousness about cutting the size of government, and that needs to change, because we already have a liberal party that is only interested. I mean, there were some very sort of astute people in Washington, D.C. Who, on the right, who wrote a series of articles in the wake of the Fiscal Cliff deal that they said, well, that tax deal, now that that's off the table, we can finally talk about spending because Democrats aren't going to come back and ask for more tax hikes. This lasted for about 6 minutes, okay, until Nancy Pelosi and Dick Durbin, and now that this morning the president's chief economic advisor said we are going to insist on more tax revenue in any debt ceiling deal. This is ridiculous. It's ludicrous, and I think that because of it, you need to have voices, frankly, like Ted Cruz, who has been out there in the media more recently. And who you will see later today. Ted is not just a conservative, but an excellent person, and it's been my pleasure to talk to him a few times over the years. And for all of you who supported him, thank you for doing so, because we need him. I think that he has struck the right tone, which is to say, the president is playing a game with this, just like he is with anything else, and he is persisting in this completely false narrative about the idea of a balanced deal. That there wasn't a balanced deal on the fiscal cliff, and he doesn't want a balanced deal on the debt ceiling because he is not serious about cutting spending. Now, maybe what it's going to take in terms of, and I know that there are a lot of people who dislike this, but maybe what it's going to take in order to cut spending in Washington is something like the sequester, is something as ham-fisted as sort of that meat cleaver approach. But if that's the only way to cut, then maybe it's the way that we have to go. And I think that with that comes the idea, I know that there are a lot of opinions about BRAC as a way to close down bases, but we may be reaching a point where we need something along those lines when it comes to entitlements, simply in the sense that I think that Congress is never going to have an actual up or down vote on this until they are absolutely forced to, and there is no other option for them to take. What we've learned time and again with these people is that they will avoid to the end any approach to cutting spending, and I think that if we persist in sort of arguing with the president on this basis, where we accept this idea of balanced deal as being a good approach, then we're always going to end up essentially negotiating over how we slice things up. Jim DeMint, who just left the Senate to lead the Heritage Foundation, has emblazoned on his wall a quote from Jesse Helms about if and I'm going to unfortunately not get it exactly right, but Helms said, if tyranny means something, and if freedom means something, then what are we doing when we negotiate over degrees of it, like slices of bologna? And I think that's really the point that we're at. If these fights actually mean something, then we've got to negotiate over the whole thing, and we can no longer engage in these kinds of wheeling and dealing, because we know at the end of the day it's always going to be false cuts that are off in the future that are never going to happen. So that's essentially my advice.
All right, one more. Ben, you run the daily Transom newsletter. Where can you get it?
Thetransom.org. You can sign up for it. You can try it for a month for $1.99 or for a year for $20. And I encourage you all to do it. Josh's recommendation is very kind, but there are a lot of people who are speaking and talking here today who I'm proud to say are Transom subscribers, and I hope you will join them.
Yes. So find it. Again, Ben, thank you very much.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you.